Hello, welcome to the Marshall and Frederick Sculpture Museum at Saginaw Valley State University. We're delighted you're here today. Today we're going to not only see the Marshall Frederick Sculpture Museum, we're also going to see a wonderful exhibition titled Pewabic Pottery, Patronage, Private Residences, Public Buildings, Sacred Spaces. We're also going to meet and talk to Dr. Thomas Brunk, the guest curator of this very special exhibition. Good afternoon, Dr. Brunk.
Hi, Marilyn. How are you?
Very good. Let me introduce to you the curator of this very, very wonderful exhibition of Pewabic pottery, historic Pewabic pottery, I might add. Dr. Thomas Brunk is a gentleman I've known for about 30 years. I met Dr. Brunk when I was working at the Archives of American Art, Smithsonian Institution, and had the honor and the privilege to process and catalog the papers of the Pewabic pottery in Detroit. It was at that time I met Dr. Brunk, and we have been friends all these many years. And so, Dr. Brunk, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Marshall Frederick Sculpture Museum, and I hope now that you will share with the audience all of your knowledge about Pewabic pottery.
Thank you, Marilyn. Welcome to the exhibit of Pewabic pottery here at the Marshall M. Frederick Sculpture Museum. Pewabic pottery was an international manifestation of the arts and crafts movement in Detroit, Michigan, and is the result of a collaboration of two talented individuals, Mary Chase Perry, later Mrs. Stratton, and Horace James Calkins. Horace Calkins was born in 1850 in Oshawa, then part of the British Empire, and started out in the dry goods business, coming to Detroit in 1870. He became involved with the dental supply business, and through that, in the interest of making kilns for dentists to fire porcelain teeth and inlays. That expanded into a business that also included furnaces and kilns for china decorators to do work in overglaze china decoration. Mary Chase Perry was born in 1867 in Hancock, Michigan, and later came to Detroit in 1882, and then studied at the Art Academy of Cincinnati and the Detroit Museum of Art School, primarily sculpture and painting, and supported herself by executing china decoration and teaching. She became involved in the marketing of Calkins kilns, called the Revelation kilns, and these are some examples signed by Miss Perry in the exhibition today. As these kilns developed, studio potters wanted to do more. They wanted to be able to fire under glaze, but the technology was not available to them until 1903, when Calkins developed and Miss Perry perfected a pottery kiln for the china decorators to make this transition to studio potters. So in this case here, we demonstrate the china decoration, the colors that they used, and then three examples of Miss Perry's work in underglaze decoration with the Revelation Pottery Detroit mark. This is the beginning of this collaboration and the beginning of the Pewabic pottery in 1901. By 1903, Miss Perry was ready to go public and start selling her wares in a national market, and Burley & Company in Chicago purchased a number of these pieces, and her sales began. We have some examples of these matte glazes, flowing matte glazes, in lamp bodies and leaded shades that they designed and made at the pottery. The glass for these shades coming from Kokomo, Indiana, Kokomo Opalescent Glass Works, which is still in business today. From there, she went on to develop other forms, particularly influenced by Asian and Oriental cultures, and as well the Persian cultures. She met and became friends with the international art collector Charles Lang Freer, who donated his collection to the Smithsonian Institution. The museum now sits on the mall, the Freer Gallery of Art. In this section, we focus on patronage, and primarily the patronage of Charles Lang Freer and his influence on Pewabic pottery. It was a unique collaboration because Freer had access to learning about the potter's art and the chemistry and glaze chemistry that goes into this. And Mary Chase Perry and Horace Calkins had access to Freer's collection of ceramics. Freer acquired the Peacock Room, painted by James Abbott McNeill Whistler, for his collection in 1904. And at that time, Mary Chase Perry made this peacock vase on the far right of me, in commemoration of that, with peacocks under glaze. There is a gourd-shaped tobacco jar that she made for Mr. Freer. That's featured in some early photographs. And what happened with the iridescent glazes is that Freer brought to the pottery some shards of Babylonian luster, what he called Babylonian luster, and challenged Miss Perry to reproduce the surface condition as though the pot had been buried in the earth for centuries. She did this and developed 6 iridescent glazes, and we show some very early examples, including some sample pieces and what she called her first iridescent, 1906, and by that meaning her first successful iridescent. We will later go and see some of the other pieces as these evolved. One of the very early ones, probably about 1903 or 1904, is this piece here, beginning to show the iridescent, the copper red iridescent inside here. There are also some tiles in this cabinet, reminiscent of the tiles that she made for Mr. Freer's gallery fireplace at his home in Detroit, Michigan. This small section deals with an important part of Pewabic's early production, which was the lamps and leaded glass shades that I mentioned before. It was discontinued by 1910. They were moving on to more exciting things for them, which was the advent of tile works and continuing their arts and crafts mission and creating beautiful things for everyday living. This small lamp here is about 1904. It's the Kokomo opalescent glass in the shade. Here are some other examples of smaller lamps. They were called electrolier. This is a lamp base, 1904, flowing matte glaze, ivory and brown. A typical lamp and leaded shade of this size would have ran between $85 and $150 in 1904. That's 10 years before Mr. Ford announces a $5 a day wage. So these were not at all inexpensive items. Very few lamps and shades are known to survive. In the case of this one, the family had this lamp until the mid-50s. It had its leaded shade on, but as the decorating styles changed, that shade was disposed of in favor of a silk cloth shade. We have some examples of the sketches that appear in the Pewabic Pottery's day books, which was a daily record of their sales that occurred, and also some other photographs of the interior of their first studio on Alfred Street in downtown Detroit. And this is the fall of 1904. Curiously enough, the plate that you see up against the wall is a 1904 freeform plate. Again, it's kind of remarkable for the time period. It's a heavy porcelaneous clay body, which Pewabic started out using, again, coming from the idea of porcelain teeth and working at high temperatures. That eventually gave way to some of the later work, particularly the iridescent pieces, which were not so highly fired. In this case, we are showing some of the early Pewabic pieces. Most of these have maple leaf marks, and you will see that within the show. There are examples of the marks from the various pieces that we have exhibited with the piece. So the curators and collectors and people interested, dealers as well, will have some examples to look at. This little inkwell in the form of a conch was Miss Perry's inkwell on her desk. It was also exhibited at the St. Louis Exposition in 1904. The matte green, flowing matte green pieces, often said that these were sort of copies of William Gruby in Boston. But in 1900, Mary Chase Perry sold William Gruby a kiln, spent some time working with him, and when you put the Pewabic glazes side against the Gruby glazes, they're considerably different. We have also some articles that were published on Miss Perry, this one in 1905 in February, showing her flowing matte glazes. Miss Perry, Mary Chase Perry, the potter, it says, Ceramic Studio. It's important to keep people in the process, and we've used a number of personal photographs throughout the show that demonstrate. Here's one of Calkins and Perry together. There are only 3 photographs of the 2 of them together, and this particular one is Miss Perry's wedding photograph in June of 1918, and the pot that she's decorating or arranging the plants in is this lovely red iridescent pot that's here. As you look at these glazes, you'll see a diversity in them. We've tried to make a selection. In an exhibit this small, it's not really this small at all, but the diversity of Pewabic is quite great. So it's not an encyclopedic exposition, it's rather one that's demonstrated to show the range of the pottery itself. And in that, we move now from these early glazes to the softer, more bright iridescent glazes for which Mary Chase Perry and Pewabic Pottery are perhaps best known. The exhibit has a rather expansive array of iridescent glazes dating from 1906 up until the 1950s. At the time that Mary Chase Perry and Horace Calkins were working in the beginning, all of these glazes had to be made from scratch. Today, studio potters buy frits and add to that their colorants to create their glazes. Very few make their own glazes from scratch. So these are rather unique and individualistic pieces. Their purpose was never to standardize their wear. They never published a catalog of their tiles or their pots, and glazes were frequently named after customers for whom they were made. Blue was Mary Chase Perry's favorite color, and it was often said that she had 2 dresses, both of them were blue. Her garden in her personal home was planted in blue flowers, and so the blues are very, very brilliant. They start usually with this blue matte 201 glaze, which is fired, and an iridescent glaze is then put over top of it to create these examples that you see here. The reds that are in the exhibit usually come from copper, which is where the name Pewabic comes from. As I said, Miss Perry was born in Hancock, Michigan, and there are 3 copper mines there, one of which is called the Pewabic Copper Mine, and green being based from copper, she selected the name Pewabic Pottery as the name of her business in 1903. She talks a little bit about the iridescent glaze in a panel, and she said, "My iridescent has been developed from a fortunate beginning into the present stage, always uncertain but less so at each time. It is an expensive